Verdun is one of the most titanic struggles of the Great War, a defining point in the conflict for both France and Germany. And once you begin to read about it, the figures connected to Verdun in 1916 are mind-boggling. Lasting more than 300 days and 300 nights, it was the longest single battle of the Great War. 2.5 million shells fell in the first 9 hours of the battle. In the central area of the battlefield, more than 1,000 shells fell for every square metre, and by the conclusion of the fighting, the casualties for both nations combined exceeded 700,000. The wider effects of the battle for France ran through the veins of the nation for the rest of the century, perhaps still do so today, and for most people, if Grand-Père served anywhere, it was Verdun. We've covered Verdun in quite a few previous podcasts, and rather than repeat the wider aspects of the history there 110 years ago, in this episode we'll focus on one action that came to personify the early phase of the battle and gave France arguably its first Verdun hero. In this, we'll look at an action around a wooded area on the northern sector of the battlefield known as the Bois de Caures, and the man who led the defenders there, Lieutenant Colonel Émile Driant. And just before we continue, episodes about Verdun always provoke questions about what books to read. And it's always good to start, in my mind, with Alistair Horn's Price of Glory, that classic book that has largely not been surpassed in terms of a single history of the battle, single volume history, even in recent years. And also the work of Christina Holstein, with her books on walking and interpreting and visiting the ground as it is today. And if you speak French, Jacques Péricard's essential study about Verdun, which we'll reference in this episode, which he produced in the 1930s, has unfortunately never been translated. Péricard's book, assembled through interviewing hundreds if not thousands of men who fought at Verdun, not just in 1916 but through all 4 years of the Great War, resulted in this huge volume. I'm looking across to my copy on the shelves just on the other side of the room here. It's a massive book with the symbol of the ossuary at Douaumont on the cover, a French artillery piece, a book packed with personal accounts of the Battle of Verdun and the fighting there, as I say, through all those 4 years, and lots of private photographs taken by ordinary soldiers on the battlefield as well. A great shame that it isn't in English, but it still is a remarkable book well worth looking out for. Details of all of these books will be on the podcast website and in the show notes, along with a map of the battlefield on the website as well. So we'll do a virtual walk of the ground as it is today to finish this episode off. And for now, we head to Verdun. The main character in this story is Émile Driant. In many ways, he was no ordinary regimental commander. Born in 1855, he was a career soldier, a graduate of Saint-Cyr, which was the French equivalent of Sandhurst, and a veteran of France's colonial campaigns. But he was also something else. Driant was a writer. Under the pen name Capitaine d'Andrit, he authored popular military adventure novels in those decades before the Great War, imagining future wars for France, wars of invasion, national peril, and heroic resistance against an enemy which generally was normally Germany. And these were novels that were often pretty anti-British, given Britain's stance over Europe in the decades since Waterloo. In those 99 years, from 1815 and the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo, to those first shots fired at Mons in August 1914, Great Britain had stood back from the wars that had raged across the European continent, something, as you can imagine, was not popular with most Europeans, particularly the French. Whenever I stand, and because of his kind of sentiments in these books, but whenever I stand at Driant's grave, I find myself almost apologising to him for being a Brit standing there honouring his service and his sacrifice. Kind of crazy thing to do, but I like to think that he'd forgive this Englishman with French blood in his veins and appreciate all of those who passed that way to honour what happened in that wood that he defended in 1916. Born at Neufchâtel-sur-Aisne, a village north of Reims, he was educated in the city of Reims and witnessed the French defeat of 1871 at the end of the Franco-Prussian War as a 16-year-old, something that inspired him to go on to become a soldier, not just a conscript, but a professional soldier. After a successful university education, he entered the French military school at Saint-Cyr, aged 20 in 1875, and was commissioned into the infantry, later serving in one of the new forts to protect France at Lieuville, a posting which resulted in his first novel, La Guerre des Forts, The War of Forts. Now, this was a period post the Franco-Prussian War in which, kind of like the Maginot Line in the lead up to the Second World War, the French looked to protect their borders with these mighty fortifications. And at that time, many thought that the next conflict between France and Germany would be fought around these fortifications, bristling with artillery, garrisoned with huge numbers of soldiers like Driant. They might be impregnable against any kind of future invasion. Driant then later served in Tunisia, attached to the 4th Zouaves, and after he married, he had a posting at Troyes with the 1st Chasseurs à Pied, that's the French light infantry, and he made such an impression on that unit, it became known as the Battalion Driant. He finally left the army at the age of 50 in 1905, and he then pursued a career in politics, but always with one eye on the military at the same time. This was a great period of change and struggle within France, with anti-Semitism, for example, rife, and scandal after scandal in the military and in the government. In 1910, he was elected as a deputy for Nancy in the French National Assembly. This was a city quite close to the new border with Germany, that area that was now occupied Alsace-Lorraine. And in those years before 1914, he warned repeatedly that France's border forts in this area, including those at Verdun, were being neglected. They'd spent all that time, all that effort, all that money building up these fortifications, and now they were being neglected at France's peril. He also saw the new advances in military technology at this time as the future, and was one of those who would encourage the development of military aviation, for example. He was a sharp critic in the reductions in artillery and manpower that took place during these years, especially in that period when Germany was so obviously gaining power. The unification of those German-speaking nations into the Greater Germany after the Franco-Prussian War created a new threat that lay before France, a threat that some politicians and commanders didn't really want to accept. Living in Paris at the time in the 16th arrondissement, his writing continued, and his trilogy entitled La Guerre de Demain, The War of Tomorrow, which had been written while he was still an army officer, looked more and more prophetic as the Great War approached. When war broke out, he was too old for military service, but Driant volunteered, hoping to get command of an army corps. But his political enemies, of which there were many, sidelined him, and he was sent to Verdun instead, being given command of the 56th and the 59th Chasseurs à Pied. So this was a combined unit, 2 light infantry units, and it was in a northern area of the battlefield, a backwater on the Western Front. So this was no kind of promotion. He was kind of sidelined. But during this period, he was also, despite all this, despite all of the odds against him, he was one of the voices that pushed, for example, for a new military award to recognise battlefield gallantry, which resulted in the Croix de Guerre being instituted in April 1915. Verdun, where he was posted to at this time, had become previously a symbol of French defiance in the Franco-Prussian War, when its citadel had stood stubbornly against Prussian and Saxon troops until forced to surrender, but a surrender that came with honour. It was perceived that way at the time. Post-war, despite the defeat, Verdun had been returned to France, but was now close to the new border of Alsace-Lorraine, now German soil, and potentially in the path of any future German invasion, a fact that had led to the development of the forts and ouvrages and entrenchments at Verdun in the decades before the First World War. But following those events in Belgium at the beginning of the conflict in 1914, when the mighty forts around Liège, built in a similar style to the ones that were in eastern France and around Verdun, had been cracked apart by super heavy German artillery, the 420mm guns, the Big Berthas, which had been brought up to take these forts on. The increased level of super heavy artillery like that had kind of made some of these fortifications redundant. And in the approach to the Battle of Verdun in 1916, in that crucial year of 1915, when Driant was in the northern part of the battlefield, the forts were downgraded, a lot of the artillery was removed, and the garrisons within the forts, like Douaumont, for example, the most expensive and elaborate fortification of all at Verdun, were reduced to very small numbers. And all of these things began to worry not just Driant, but other commanders too. Following the early battles of the Great War, that front at Verdun that Driant had moved into in 1915, the fighting there had resulted in a salient, a massive salient, of which Verdun was at the heart, a curvature in the line which followed the high ground on both banks of the Meuse, swung round the city, and then went south towards Saint-Mihiel, towards another salient there. And in that autumn of 1915, less than 6 months before the beginning of the battle, Driant, now a lieutenant colonel, took his proud chasseurs into the northern part of that salient as they took over that wooded sector in the Bois de Caures. The Bois de Caures is a large wooded area south of the village of Flabba, which by 1915 was in German hands. The woods here were separated by some open ground. This was no man's land between the French and the German positions, but they bottlenecked to the east, and there the lines were very, very close indeed. It's almost a track width's distance between the French and the German front line. The woods in French hands sat at a road junction in that northern sector of the Verdun salient, which in turn gave access south to the forts and the defences around Douaumont, and the pathway, of course, to Verdun itself. And as soon as Driant came here, he realised the importance of this position and was acutely aware of how under-defended it was. So from that autumn of 1915 until the battle in February 1916, he gradually built up those defences within his regimental sector. Many of the trenches here were shallow, so the chasseurs improved those, improved the trench supports and the sandbags and the depth of the trenches. The infantry shelters here were made of logs, as trees, of course, within a wooded area were in great profusion, but he felt that these would not stand against heavy artillery, so they were improved by using sheet iron and other material to make them stronger. Contemporary photographs show fairly basic barbed wire defences in the Bois de Caures, with many of them chevaux de frise, which is quite common for that early period of the Great War, where two crossbeams were put together and wire wound round it, creating a movable barbed wire defensive position, but vulnerable to artillery fire and vulnerable even to being pushed over or rearranged by the enemy themselves. So again, wiring, preparing your defences, stopping the enemy from getting into your positions was all part of the work that the chasseurs did when they were in this sector. The defences within the Bois de Caures held by Driant and his men did have the advantage of being on slopes with pretty good fields of fire over that open bit of ground, for example. But Driant bulked up the line here with the construction of a number of concrete bunkers. Some of these were command posts, including his own PC or poste de commandement, which was a large rectangular bunker with several chambers which had direct telephone links to frontline positions and back to rear headquarters as well. It had rear apertures in the bunker, which you can still see today, for signalling lamps. If the telephone lines broke down in artillery fire, you could lamp a message with Morse code back to a relay point, and you could also use those apertures to release pigeons with messages to fly back to pre-designated location. And this kind of mirrors the signalling, the communications experience of many, many units on the Western Front, fighting this new war, fighting it with modern weapons, but trying to control it with 19th century levels of communication, often which were fairly primitive. Elsewhere in the Bois de Caures, he also had several horizontal bunkers, which were positions for the Chasseurs machine guns, which included the Saint-Étienne and the Hotchkiss machine gun. They had crapouillots, trench mortars, which could give fire support, and that was an increasingly important battlefield weapon. Crapouillots, a toad. The mortars got that name because the munitions that they fired from the various different types of them looked like a toad leaping through the air. And by 1915, as Driant and his men took over this sector and began to improve it, trench mortars as a battlefield weapon were now an essential part of any unit's arsenal in the frontline area. But despite all this work, the positions, it was clear, were far from ideal. The time they spent here went on, and it became clearer and clearer to Driant that something was coming at Verdun. The more they defended this ground, the more they improved it, the more they raided the enemy and engaged with the enemy, they could see that something was coming. And this was further enforced when one of Driant's political contacts, the King of Spain, warned him of a coming German offensive at Verdun. Driant relayed this to the French High Command, but it's clear that he wasn't liked. He was a difficult man, a direct man, and he had his enemies. Many didn't like that directness, but none could cut through that. None of those he spoke to could cut through that and listen to what he was saying, and that warning really went unheeded. In Jacques Péricard's account of Verdun, he wrote of Driant, a man of medium height, vigorous in appearance, with an energetic and open face marked by a thick, almost white moustache, and eyes of flame through which his whole soul seemed to shine. A brave man, and a good man. A brave man, for none of us ever saw him lower his head or seek shelter under the fiercest barrages. A good man, for he loved his chasseurs, and he had made himself adored by them. His door was wide open to all, and even the humblest could knock, certain of being welcomed and of finding with him the comfort they might need. Péricard went on to describe the poilus who served, the soldiers who served in the 56th and the 59th Battalion Chasseurs à Pied. He said, they were no longer young men, but reservists, some already of an age to pass into the Territorial Army Reserve. Since the beginning of the campaign, they had not had a single day of real rest in the rear, and to this fatigue was added, for many of them, natives of invaded regions, the anxiety for families left behind without any news. The two battalions were quite different. The 56th, composed exclusively of men from the north, miners and factory workers, hot-headed, rather noisy and undisciplined, yet forming a very brave and spirited unit. The 59th, more mixed, included chiefly men from the Saint-Quentin region, the Orne and the Meuse, largely farmers, calmer and more measured men, all dutiful and as brave as their comrades of the 56th. But the two battalions, however different in appearance, truly formed a single, very homogeneous group, thanks to the spirit that animated them, that chasseur spirit of bravery, self-sacrifice, solidarity, fraternity, pride and loyalty, which only those who have not experienced it can belittle. For Driant and the men he commanded, it seemed like they were on their own, waiting to face the storm. The truth, however, was that they were not entirely isolated here in the Bois de Caures, with other French units on their flanks, facing the same storm as them and anticipating the same fate. Émile Driant wrote to his wife on the eve of the battle, I am writing you only a few hurried lines, for I am going up there to encourage all my men and to see the final preparations. The order from the general which I am sending you, and Joffre's visit yesterday, prove that the hour is near, and deep down I feel a certain satisfaction in seeing that I was not mistaken when a month ago I announced what is now happening in the battalion order I sent you. God's grace be with us. You see, I shall do my best, and I feel very calm. I have always had such good fortune that I still believe in it this time. Their assault may take place tonight, or it may yet be delayed for several days, but it is certain our wood will have its front trenches taken within the first minutes, for they will use flame and gas there. We know it from a prisoner taken this morning. My poor battalions, so spared until now, well, they too have had their luck up to the present. Who knows? But our small one feels at such moments. For Driant, all his fears and anxieties were about to be realised in the most brutal way imaginable. At 7:15 a.m. on the 21st of February 1916, the morning sky lit up with the power of one of the largest barrages of the war, as 2.5 million shells fell on the French lines at Verdun over the next 9 hours. Just think about those figures again. 2.5 million shells in 9 hours. That amounts to more than 4,600 shells a minute. German weapons, from trench mortars to the 420mm howitzers, came into play, often with devastating effect. The key turning point of 1916 saw the old world fade and a new world of industrial firepower and industrial death become supreme. One observer wrote, "The infantry was the martyr, but not the queen of the battle. The queen was artillery. Contrary to pre-war ideas, it was artillery that conquered the ground, because it did not fire merely on lines, but thanks to an enormous expenditure of munitions, drenched and rendered untenable deep zones of the battlefield." It was almost like a warning from one of Driant's pre-war books being realised before their very eyes. In the Bois de Caures, the sector defended by Driant's chasseurs, the positions were torn apart. Trees struck by shells became weapons themselves, as wood shrapnel rained down on the men below and cut men to pieces. After what is thought to have been more than 80,000 shells dropped onto Driant's positions here, the Germans finally attacked at 4 p.m. Stormtroops made the attack from pre-prepared positions in the wooded area close to Flabba, and as Driant had predicted, made heavy use of grenades and flamethrowers and gradually penetrated the French lines here. An account by Colonel Grasset gives a flavour of the fighting. It is a closed position, and Lieutenant Robin has at his disposal an entire platoon, perhaps reduced in number but vigorous and determined to defend itself to the end. He himself, rifle in hand, stands in the front rank. From three sides the enemy attacks. The barbed wire network, half destroyed, does not prevent the assailants from reaching the trench parapet. At first they fight with rifles, and Sergeant Cousin, firing rapidly at less than 10 metres, kills 7 Germans. Then the struggle continues with grenades, and finally with bayonets and rifle butts. Death spares Lieutenant Robin, who is lightly wounded in the foot by a grenade fragment, but Chasseur Hénin, who alone barred a communication trench against an enemy half-section, falls, his head crushed by a rifle butt. Sergeant Major Simon is disfigured by a grenade. Sergeant Berthe has his jaw shattered by a bullet. Chasseur Dubois has his abdomen opened by a bayonet thrust. I mean, when we read accounts like that, we can see how ferocious, how bloody, how bitter this fighting was in the Bois de Caures. And the fighting remains tough and bloody. At one point, a small machine gun section under Sergeant Léger of around 14 men with St. Etienne's and Hotchkiss guns held up a massive German advance in their sector. But of course, ammunition for machine guns never lasts forever, and in the end they smashed their weapons and fought on with grenades until Sergeant Léger was wounded. Driant in this seemed to be everywhere, encouraging his men, trying to stay in touch from his command post with the wider battlefield around him. And as night time approached on that first day, there was a snowy fog, poor visibility, and while the Germans had taken much of the wooded area, incredibly, Driant's chasseurs were still holding on. Next morning, on the 22nd of February, the German artillery opened up again to fire deeper into the French lines and on the units around Driant's flanks. Gradually, the Bois de Caures became a salient within a salient, which could so easily be pinched off by the advancing enemy. By mid-afternoon, what remained of the 56th and the 59th were almost surrounded. The position was untenable. Émile Driant realised this and ordered a fighting withdrawal towards friendly lines at the nearby village of Beaumont. Men fought their way through the German outposts. Many were killed in the process, were wounded or captured, but some did make it out. In the command post, all of the unit's records were destroyed. Driant wanted nothing to fall into the hands of the enemy, and crossing the road nearby into the next part of the woodland, he stopped to help a wounded chasseur when he himself was hit by a bullet in the head and killed instantly. Driant had fallen. With this, the position collapsed. Only a handful of the 1,200 officers and men from Driant's force made it back to the French lines. Not all died, but many were taken prisoner. Driant's body was found by the Germans and identified from the papers in his pockets, and aware of the status of this man, he was given a proper and decent and honourable burial by the Germans on the battlefield. The Germans went further. They wrote to his family via the Red Cross to assure them of this proper burial, and even sent a photograph of the grave. And meanwhile, reports of Driant's heroic death reached the French command at Verdun, who at first refused to believe it, but soon the propaganda value of his gallant defence was realised, and Driant became one of the first public heroes of the Battle of Verdun. His name was everywhere, in every public newspaper, and on the lips of almost every Frenchman at that time. Driant was a man who had warned everyone about this attack, and now it was realised. He had stood firm, demonstrated his supreme gallantry, but paid the ultimate price in that bitter struggle for the northern part of the Verdun salient. Colonel Driant's battle in that northern part of the Verdun salient in the Bois de Caures was one part of the opening phase of the Battle of Verdun in February 1916, far from being the only part of the events in those early days of that long, long battle. But it came to stand for something much bigger, for the sacrifice of French troops and the bravery of those men on the ground. And as the battle continued, of course, that sacrifice got bigger and bigger. It kind of propelled Verdun, really, into a status that no other French battlefield really had ever occupied. When I first visited Verdun in 1987, on a random day one summer, I was surprised even then just how many other people were there. I kind of thought in the 80s, when we compared it to the British sector of the Western Front, which was pretty much empty, there would be no one at Verdun as well, but that was not the case. I remember stopping on the forest edge near Douaumont and walking in amongst the trees. There were shell holes and trenches everywhere. That landscape of the Great War was very, very present, and much of those trenches and shell holes were still filled with battlefield detritus, helmets, mess tins and bayonets and all kinds of stuff, and it felt wrong to even touch it, let alone pick it up. But nearly 40 years later, of course, the relics have gone, but it is still a frequently visited battlefield, perhaps less so by British visitors, which is a shame, but every time I go there now, I see more and more school groups visiting Verdun, not just from France, but from Germany as well, which is a very good sign. It's an area that I've been to countless times, but it draws me back time and time again. And there is a presence, perhaps, at Verdun because of those events in 1916 that feels different to other battlefields of the Western Front and of the Great War. We've already mentioned Christina Holstein's books. They're essential, really, for any visit to Verdun. I can't recommend them enough. And, of course, there are some episodes of the podcast in the back catalogue relating to Verdun, including Verdun in a Day. But focusing on this area, as we have done in this podcast, where that kind of tip of the spear, where the Battle of Verdun began in the Bois de Caures, what can we find today of Émile Driant's gallant stand. I've put a map on the podcast website so you can follow this short walk, which can be done in less than a couple of hours. You can park up and you can walk this ground and you can see, reach out and quite literally touch this part of the Verdun battlefield. We're going to start on the road overlooking the open fields between the wooded area just south of that village of Flabber. Across the fields in front of us, the wooded area we can see there, that is the German front line. And those woods, which are private, unlike the rest of the forest around us, which is part of the Verdun National Forest, those woods contain the German positions. Some years ago I was lucky to go in there with Christina Holstein to have a look at the German positions with the permission of the owner, and it's amazing how preserved those German lines are, with the Stollen shelters that they sheltered in before the assault and the ramps that took them rapidly out of the trenches into no man's land to make their assault. All of that is in there, and it's not alone in that Verdun battlefield to have trench systems like that just about everywhere. But standing there, you can see that this part of the battlefield where the first attack began was slightly different. To our left, the tree line goes off, and that's where some of the horizontal bunkers are located, where Driant had his machine gunners with the Saint-Étiennes and the Hotchkiss guns in them, opening fire across this ground. And we can see what good fields of fire they would have had. To our right, where the two bits of woodland kind of converge, is where you come into that point in the east, where the two front lines were very, very close together. And I think if you look at the early phase of the battle, that was obviously one of the places where the Germans were able to get in a lot quicker with flamethrowers and grenades and close assaults on the French positions there. So this is where it began. This was the front line. And when we walk back down along the road, you can venture off into the forest. You can see trenches. There are a few paths here and there. A lot of it you'll see is undulating ground, kind of showing just how devastated this ground was by bombardments during the Great War, because fighting didn't return here in 1916. This remained behind the German lines for a big chunk of the war after the 1916 battle, but it did return here in 1918, and we're not far from one of the places where American units went into action on the last day of the First World War, and where Henry Gunther, the last American casualty, who was killed at 10:59 on the 11th of November 1918, where he was killed. So the war returned here later on, and we're seeing the kind of overlapping of those two periods of conflict here. But as we walk back down the road and look into the woods, when I was last there this spring, the undergrowth is quite low, so you can see quite a long way into the wooded area, and you can see the trenches, the second line and the third line and the communication trenches, and you begin to see some of the bunkers in there as well that Driant had built, and you come closer to where his main command post was. And what they've done here now is create a little walk through this part of the Bois de Caures that takes you off the road over to the command post, and you can follow it round to some of the other locations as well. We're going to follow a slightly different route. But going into the wood here, up to the command post, this is where we find the main bunker that Driant had built for his headquarters. It's quite a large bunker, and there's a kind of curved wall around it with almost like a little moat on the outside, and a little bridge that you walk across to go across that little moat into the area where the bunker is. Those aren't original features, but that curved wall has plinths on it with French helmets, Adrienne helmets on the top, and these act as memorials to the 56th and the 59th Chasseurs, and many of the officers of those units are mentioned on the back of these plinths if you have a look. It's not in the best of condition. I noticed that when I was there again this spring, some of them are moving around a bit, but there does appear to be a process of renovation going on, because you can go down the original steps into the command bunker, you can walk around in there. I mean, at certain times of the year there can be quite a lot of mosquitoes in there, and sometimes flooding after heavy rain. One part of it is being renovated and it's closed off, but it's still there. I mean, this is the original bunker where Driant was. You can stand in there, see where his command post was. You can see those apertures where they could lamp back to the relay post behind, or where they could release the pigeons to carry messages back to command headquarters further back down the line. And it's a very, very evocative place. You can sit there with the natural world around you. I had chiff-chaffs, of course, singing in the trees there. I could hear a woodpecker in the distance. It's a kind of timeless place. It's very much still a woodland, the kind of woodland the Chasseurs would have seen when they first moved in there in 1915. The crumbling remains of their trenches go off in kind of almost every direction, and then at the heart of it is Driant's bunker. From there we walk back through the wood back to the road, and we can cross over that road close to the spot where he was killed and go to the actual memorials that are in that next bit of the wood. And the first of these, which this area's had quite a lot of its woodland cleared and is gradually being replanted, we see the memorial that marks the spot where Driant was killed, just a few yards in from the road itself. And if we go deeper into the wood, we find an area again cleared where there's a little curbstone and a cross, and this is not an actual grave, but it marks the spot where Colonel Driant was originally buried. So you can kind of follow the story around on the ground using Christina Holstein's books, using these first-hand accounts. History very much comes alive when you walk this bit of the Verdun battlefield. And following the pathway and the avenue past the spot where he was killed, back towards the main road, towards that road junction, that brings you up to the main memorial here, which is a large monument sitting at the top of the bank with crosses, graves around the back of it. They've cleared a little bit of the woodland behind it now, and again, part of that trail goes off at the rear of the monument back towards Driant's command post, and you can cross over, go up the steps. Either side of the wall of the memorial is mention of the 56th and the 59th Chasseurs. And what you're looking at when you stand here is not just a memorial to the Chasseurs, the light infantry and their colonel. It is Émile Driant's grave. This is where he is buried, overlooking the grounds that they'd defended. And at the back of him, those graves, when you walk along the row, they're all unknown Chasseurs who fell in this battle. The bulk of the dead who were recovered were taken to either French military cemeteries nearby or repatriated back to cemeteries in their communes of northern France and the other areas where those units recruited from to be buried with their kith and kin. And it's here every February, on the anniversary of the battle in this area around the memorial, that they have a commemoration service. And again, when I was there recently, this was just a few weeks after that commemorative service, and the wreaths were still on Driant's grave. It's clear that 110 years later, after events here in 1916, Émile Driant remains the hero of France that he ever was. Because Driant never left the Bois de Caures. He stands here amongst his chasseurs for all time on that ground that was theirs, paid for in their blood, their unique old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.